But what we're doing in ethics is we want to ask questions about how we ought to live, what the good life is, maybe even what happiness consists in. And we have lots of different kinds of those questions. So let me adjust my camera real quick. So we have very concrete, particular questions like the ones we're considering this week about whether we are within our rights to restrict immigration into our country, and if so, how much, and if not, what are the limits of that? There's lots of nuance to these questions, but they are about relatively specific real-world examples or questions about how we ought to be approaching a particular issue. We're going to consider only one of these because, again, we've got a lot of area to cover. Oh, I think my camera finally just focused. Okay. But there are other examples of what we would call applied ethics issues. That's what this is. Could be gun rights, lots of these rights-based questions. Whether you have a duty to donate to charity or how much of your resources you have a duty to give. We could talk about abortion, whether it's morally permissible, under what circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. We could talk about, what are their hot button issues? Anyway, but you get the picture. But anyway, so those are applied ethics issues. On the total other end of the spectrum, you have deeply theoretical issues. Maybe one that you might be acquainted with is whether moral truth is objective or relative. This is kind of the question I wrote my dissertation on. The question is, are there any moral truths that are true regardless of what we think or feel? Or on the other hand, so that would be saying that morality is objective. There's an objective truth to morality, that even if everyone thought or felt this way, the moral truth could be different. To put it in a way that kind of biases the answer towards moral objectivity, if everyone, moral objectivists are going to say, if everyone thought that the Holocaust was permissible, it would still be wrong. So it's independent of our opinions or feelings that the Holocaust was wrong. If the Nazis had won and they had, brainwashed everybody into thinking that they were the best and that this was okay, it still wouldn't be okay. Everyone would think it was okay, granted, yeah, but that's something that's happening in people's heads. Whether it would actually be okay is a different question, and of course it would not be morally permissible, even though everyone thought so. So that's the case, or that's a very, very, very quick version of the case for moral objectivity. On the other hand, some people want to say that no, morality is kind of like it's all in your head. It's maybe dependent on your culture. If your culture says that abortion is permissible, then abortion is permissible for you. And if your culture says abortion is impermissible, then abortion is impermissible for you. It all just depends on what your culture says. Those are called cultural relativists. And on the other hand, you have individual relativists. People think, no, it really depends on what you think. And that doesn't really, your culture is not as significant or not significant at all. Okay, so that's on those are the two ends of the ethical spectrum. You've got the applied issues, applied to the particular issues in the real world. And then on the other hand, you've got this more abstract thing, these big questions about the objectivity of ethics or relativism, whether we can know moral truths, so moral epistemology, if you want to use the fancy term. And then in the middle, ethical issues like that are partially theoretical and partially not, like what the correct moral theory is. That's stating things too broadly. You've got a debate between people who call themselves consequentialists and people who call themselves consequentialists or maybe deontologists. If you read the reading for this week, you saw the word deontologist. The word deontology or deontologist. Wellman describes his argument as a deontological argument, and you probably if you have no exposure to this stuff, didn't know what that meant. Maybe you Googled it or something and found out roughly what it meant. But the debate there is about whether our obligations always depend on the consequences of our actions. And you might think, isn't that just like obviously true? And some people think no. And if you really want, those are the deontologists. The people who think yes are the consequentialists, as you'd expect. And to give you a case, think about just the kinds of cases that Wellman talks about, not the immigration cases, but cases of fundamental inviolable rights. So cases where you have a right to do something even if it produces bad consequences. Yeah, exactly. And regardless of what kinds of consequences it produces, you have a right to free speech. It's permissible for you to say something or to say what you want to say, even if it actually hurts people in a certain way. I mean, maybe there are limits to that, and y'all are probably thinking, maybe I don't know, there might be cases where you can't say whatever you want. But the point being, rights, even if there are limitations to them, they still obtain, even if respecting people's rights doesn't produce the best consequences. Yeah. Okay, sorry. So that's a dive into this whole spectrum of the different kinds of ethical issues. So we're starting with a really applied issue. That's Wellman's argument that immigration, countries can restrict immigration in virtually any way that they want. And then we'll end with the big questions about, or the big abstract questions about objectivity of ethics versus relativism. And I figured we would do that because, you hit like the big important question. Sorry, you hit the concrete questions first to kind of get you in on the shallow end of the pool. It's not a shallow question by any means, but if you start with the concrete, you can sort of maybe work your way up to getting your head around these bigger more abstract questions. I was going to say abstracter. Okay, so that's sort of what ethics is, or at least the way we're going to do ethics. So how do you figure out what the main argument of a passage is? Well, in this case, honestly, you're a little spoiled. I mean, I know that there are some problems with philosophical articles like this. They use some jargon. They maybe use bigger words on average. Maybe the sentences are slightly more complex on average than other kinds of passage. But here's what I mean by being spoiled on passages like this. They kind of tell you. They're really clear, and this is what analytic philosophers really strive for, and they don't always succeed at, but we really strive to be clear on the purpose of an article or a book chapter or whatever. And so when I'm looking at this, I mean, you read the introduction, and Wellman tells you what he's going to be trying to do, what he's going to be arguing for, and how he's going to do it, right? So the very first sentence is in this article I appeal to freedom of association to defend a state's right to control immigration over its territorial borders. He tells you, basically, in short form right there, what his conclusion is going to be. So, and he also kind of tells you what his premises are going to be. Not in detail, you're going to have to read a little bit further, but he gives you the bird's eye view. I appeal to freedom of association to defend a state's right to control immigration over its territorial borders. So I appeal to freedom of association to defend blah, 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 tells you that freedom of association is going to be a key part of the premise because he's using it to defend this other claim over here, which he's indicating is his conclusion, to defend a state's right to control immigration over its territorial borders. He's saying there, what I'm ultimately going to defend is a state's right to control immigration over its territorial borders. That is, the conclusion is going to be that states have the right to control immigration over their borders. Right? So right there, he tells you a ton about what his premise is going to look like, premises are going to look like, what his conclusion is going to be. Based on that alone, you wouldn't be able to write out the argument, but it gives you a really good feel for the kinds of things you should be looking for. Oh, okay, now I know that whatever the premises are, they've got something to do with freedom of association. oh, okay, now I know that whatever the conclusion specifically is going to be, he's going to be somehow arguing that states have the right to control immigration. How do they have the right to control immigration? How much? We don't know yet, but it's still really useful to know that that's the general area that the conclusion is going to be in. Okay, without denying blah, 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 blah. You read on, and he gets even a little more specific here in this second paragraph. This article is divided into 4 sections. First, I argue for a presumptive case in favor of a state's right to limit immigration as an instance of its more general right to freedom of association. Again, I'm not telling you much extra there because you kind of already knew that he was going to be arguing for a state's right to limit immigration. And we kind of already knew that that was because of freedom of association, and he's kind of reiterating that. But again, now you've got 2 kind of clear signposts telling you generally what the premises are going to look like, generally what the conclusion is going to look like. And after that, it's sort of just a process. You kind of know those things, and now you're kind of sifting through the rest of this to get a clearer picture, a more precise picture of how the argument works. What you'll also want to do is be able to sift out where he's already finished giving his argument and where he's just giving responses to objections or something like that. So if you scroll down here later into the body of this section, I mean, you get lots of late in the game here, late in this section, you get lots of indicators that he's kind of given you his general argument, and now he's kind of just pointing out features of it. Before turning to the case against political freedom of association, I would like to highlight 2 features of the view I'm advancing here. So now he's just talking to you about the argument that he's already given, right? And you can kind of tell reading that the main argument has already happened. The action has happened. We're at that part of the movie now where they're just showing that everybody's happy and whatever, and you know, everybody gets along. All the main action has happened. And again, down here, starting with the second aspect of my account, is all he's doing in these paragraphs, if you'll look at them closely, is he's trying to differentiate his argument from other people's argument. He's saying, I'm not like those people who argue for the right to restrict immigration based on keeping a coherent culture. But again, that's not giving his argument. He's not giving his argument here. He's saying my argument differs from these other people. I'm not doing this, right? If he's saying I'm not giving this kind of argument, question, is he telling you what his argument is like? Well, not really. I mean, you might be able to learn a little bit about it, correct misconceptions you had, but he's telling you, I've given you my argument, and now let me tell you, it's not this kind of thing. Let me emphasize, it's not the kind of thing that depends on keeping a coherent culture. Okay, so again, I'm trying to keep the video short, so I'm not going to go super in depth here and, you know, sentence by sentence tell you what I'm looking at when I do that. But this is sort of the kind of thing I'm looking for when I go to summarize an argument. And again, at least for your first essay, the passage you'll be working with is going to be much shorter than this, and it's not going to be super confusing. I'm picking things. I'm leading you in the shallow end of the pool. I'm not throwing you in the deep end. Yeah. So how many of y'all have had that experience where you're like, gosh, I don't like this. This seems wrong, and I don't know